Hi, I'm Gary Ford from Tiger Hobbies Limited. With the recent announcement by Airfix of the 148 Phantom II FG.1 of the Royal Navy, there is understandably renewed interest in the Phantom II, especially the British variants. So we at Tiger Hobbies will have a look at some of the Phantom models we have in stock or can be ordered, both die-cast and plastic kits. Before we look at the models, I thought I would cover some potted history of the British variants of the McDonnell Douglas Phantom II. The Phantom II was the first true Generation 3 multi-role jet aircraft entering service with the United States Navy and Marines as Phantom II and the United States Air Force as the F-110 Spectre in the very early 60s. But this was quickly dropped in the favour of the universal US service name of F-4 Phantom II. In the early 1950s, most of the UK attention as far as military aircraft goes was to the V-bombers, Vickers Valiant, Hadley Page Victor, and of course the Avro Vulcan, with our fighter aircraft and tactical aircraft still basically Generation 1 and Generation 2. Yes, we had the English Electric Lightning, an incredibly fast machine, but with poor weapon load and fairly short range. We also had Hawker Hunters for close air support and the English Electric Canberra jet bomber as Invicta Strike. The Royal Navy had the Blackburn Buccaneer just about entering service in the early 60s and the Sea Vixen for air defence. On the drawing board was the Hawker P1154, a supersonic version of what would become the Harrier, and the companies that made up the British Aircraft Corporation were well on their way to developing the TSR-2. Both the P1154 and TSR-2 were mired with difficulties, and the Royal Air Force and Royal Navy could not agree on the capabilities of P1154, and it highlighted inter-service rivalries. TSR-2 was becoming a massive money pit, with the Royal Air Force wanting to have more and more capability. This was also undermined by poor procurement issues, and TSR-2 was the last major project of what was known as the Ministry of Supply. Now today we've got the Ministry of Defence, but in those days we still had the Admiralty that looked after the Royal Navy, the War Office that looked after the Army. There's the old joke, War Office, do you want to fight, when answering the telephone? And obviously the Air Ministry that looked after the Royal Air Force. And also there was a massive, huge government bureaucratic organisation called the Ministry of Supply. The new government in 1964 had tough choices to make, and both P1154 and TSR-2 were for the chop, along with the Armstrong-Whitworth 681 strategic jet cargo aircraft. I will leave a link to a presentation about the TSR-2 by the Royal Aeronautical Society held at Arif Cosford about 2 years ago. There are lots of lectures and a number of episodes, but I will link to the panel discussion and the one that covers the overall procurement failures of TSR-2. Initially, the United Kingdom government looked at the F-111 aardvark to cover the role of the English Electric Canberra in the interdictor strike role for the Royal Air Force. But the Royal Navy were more than happy to take a look at the new US Phantom II, which was already providing fleet defence for the United States Navy, and trials on UK carriers was successful. To keep the costs per unit down, it decided by the mid-60s that the Royal Air Force would also take the F-4 Phantom. They weren't particularly happy about it, but to keep the costs down, the UK government required the Royal Air Force to take the Phantom, and the original requirement was close to 400 aircraft for both Royal Air Force and Royal Navy needs. The UK F-4 Phantom II would be based on the F-4J Phantom, but component parts were made in the United Kingdom and shipped to St. Louis, Missouri for final assembly. In fact, 43% of the airframe was made in the United Kingdom. The US gave the designation F-4K for the air defence version for the Royal Navy and F-4M for the ground attack and reconnaissance version for the Royal Air Force. But these designations generally were for US use only. So the Department of Defence oversees sales, and the McDonnell Douglas production lines to identify aircraft on production line. In service, they would be known for the Royal Navy as the FG.1, or Fighter Ground Attack, and for the Royal Air Force as the FGR-2, Fighter Ground Attack and Reconnaissance. The major change was the replacement of the General Electric J79 with the Rolls-Royce Spey engine that gave more power at takeoff and a longer range, but a lower top end, but not by much. Due to cutbacks, the production run for the UK4 was reduced to 170, with about 120 for the Royal Air Force and about 50 for the Fleet Air Arm. Thus the cost of the UK F4 would be over twice that of a standard US F4J Phantom. The first flight for both aircraft took place at St. Louis in 1966 for the F4K and 1967 for the F4M. And by the very early 70s, in fact the back end of 1969, all UK aircraft were produced and in service. But the UK government would be looking at cutting back the carriers for the Royal Navy, in fact starting earlier with the cancellation of the new CVA-01 Queen Elizabeth class, leaving HMS Ark Royal and HMS Eagle to be refitted to take the Phantoms. But Eagle's refit would not take place, and the Fleet Air Arm did not need as many FG-1s. So 20 or so aircraft were transferred to the Royal Air Force at RAF Lucas to form 43 Squadron in the air defence role to complement the English Electric Lightning. In 1968, 700 Naval Air Squadron Fleet Air Arm was set up for testing, and later 767 Squadron Naval Air Squadron and 228 Operational Conversion Unit for the Royal Air Force were both set up to convert aircrew to the new aircraft, with 892 Squadron for the Fleet Air Arm commissioned as the first Phantom unit in 1969 and soon began sea trials. Also in 69, 6 Squadron stood up for the Royal Air Force, so only 3 years from first flight for the Fleet Air Arm and 2 years for the RAF to squadron service. By the early 1970s, the Phantom FGR-2 equipped some 3 squadrons in the UK, number 6, 54 and number 41 Squadron, with another 4 in what was RAF Germany, 2 Squadron, 14 Squadron, 17 and 31 Squadrons in the Tactical Nuclear Strike Role. The Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm equipped only 892 Squadron on HMS Ark Royal, at the time the only Royal Navy carrier, after HMS Victorious and HMS Eagle were placed into retirement. And by 1978, the last Fleet Air Arm Phantom launched from the carrier. The UK TV series Sailor, about the 1976 deployment to the United States, made famous the HMS Ark Royal and its crew, and the aircraft such as Phantoms, Buccaneers, Wessex, Sea King and the Gannet, and gave a good insight into the Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm at the time, and also not forgetting the massive number 1 hit, or certainly high in the charts by Rod Stewart, of Sailing, which was the theme tune to the Sailor TV series. By the early 1970s, the Royal Air Force was starting to take on board the Seppercat Jaguar, and by 1974-75, many of the Royal Air Force Phantom squadrons in the close air support role went to the Jaguar, with the last 41 Squadron converting in 1977. At Royal Air Force Lucas, 43 Squadron Phantoms had shown the F4 was a better all-round air defence aircraft than the English Electric Lightning, with far better range and a larger and more effective weapon load. By 1974, Treble 1 Squadron had become operational on the FGR-2 in the air defence role, and more F4 Phantoms took this role over as we started to run down the fleet of the English Electric Lightning, and as Jaguars also took over from the F4 in the close air support role, leaving the last English Electric Lightning squadrons at Royal Air Force Binbrook, 5 and 11 Squadron. With the retirement of HMS Ark Royal in 1978, the remaining Phantom FG-1s, along with its Buccaneer aircraft, were transferred over to the Royal Air Force, and in fact Treble 1 Squadron reconverted to the FG-1 to keep most of the FG-1 fleet at Royal Air Force Lucas in air defence. RAF Coningsby, RAF Wattisham and Royal Air Force Wildenrath in Germany provided the UK and NATO with air defence using the FGR-2, along with the remaining English Electric Lightning squadrons at Binbrook. In 1982, after the Falklands War, a squadron of Phantoms was sent to the Falklands for air defence, but NATO stated, well, you need to plug the gap. So the UK government had to get more F4s. But the UK version was over 10 years out of production, so a squadron of US Phantoms would be purchased. The Royal Air Force, of course, wanted the latest F4S, but in the end had to settle for some 15 ex-US Navy and Marine F4Js, but were modified up to F4S standards. And by 1984, number 74 Tiger Squadron was equipped with what is now known as the Phantom II F4J UK. Now, because the new Tornado F3 was in its very early stage of production, they were going to originally call this Royal Air Force, new Royal Air Force Phantom, the F3, but started to go along with F4J UK. And they'll keep this type for about 8 years. By 1987, the previously mentioned Tornado F3 air defence variant was entering service, and slowly the Phantoms would leave UK service, actually preceded by the remaining English Electric Lightnings in Binbrook in 1988, and the FG.1 was retired in 1990. The F4J UK soldiered on for another nearly 2 years until the back end of 1991, and the last Phantoms, the FGR2s, in late 1992, possibly early 1993. Thus ended about 25 years of service of the British Phantom variant. So, let's look at some Phantom models you can buy from Tiger Hobbies. I always quote the recommended retail price, so keep it fair. There's been the odd reviewers on YouTube who sometimes quote RRPs for the brands they do not favour, and the market value for the brands they do favour, thus making the brands they do favour look more attractive. Remember, the RRP, or sometimes the SRP, so it's recommended retail price or suggested retail price, is set by the manufacturers, importers and distributors for the benefit of the consumer, i.e. the retail public. The market value is obviously the price that these products sell once they get to market, i.e. model shops both online and bricks and mortar will often offer a little discount, and they're free to do that. So, on the turntable is the Hobbymaster HA19068, a 72nd scale diecast Phantom F4J UK that's in stock at Tiger Hobbies at $79.99 as part of our core range. To the left is a 50th anniversary Turkish F4 Phantom that amazingly are still in service some 66 years after the first F4 Phantoms entered service with the US military in 1960. Hobbymaster have released almost 200 versions of the F4 Phantom in all US and non-UK export versions, including a number of F4J UKs. At some point we may see a 72nd scale diecast British version of the Phantom 2 by HM. But as you can see on the table to the right of the F4J UK is an actual diecast RAF FGR2 from 92 Squadron RAF Wildenrath by Gemini Aces. But this has not been issued for at least 12 years, perhaps a little more. But be very, very careful. Prices of these are going through the roof, and at the moment it's around about £150 entry level to get one. Really limited versions and really mint versions are going upwards of £300. I was very lucky. This is part of my little collection. I picked up this from a railway dealer. Needed a bit of fettling. It's used some spare, I think, drop tanks and a missile from an Hobbymaster Phantom. But I picked this one up for £30. Also in 148 diecast, be very careful searching for 148 RAF Phantoms, because Franklin Mint actually did an F4J UK and painted it to look like an FGR2, but it's obviously wrong. But now, obviously, in recent years, Corgi have actually released a number of British Phantom variants, FG1, FGR2, in 148 diecast, and they're superb models. So now let's look at Phantom 2 model kits. Behind, or on camera, obviously, is a selection of F4 kits we sell at Tiger Hobbies. Not the full selection, we've got other versions you can buy as well. But in the centre, you'll see a large Tamiya 1/32nd scale US Marine F4J. Now this is an RRP of $104.99. Again, market value may get it a little cheaper. It's an older kit, but like all Tamiya kits, still great quality. We also normally have in stock the new 148 Tamiya Phantom F4B. This is a fantastic kit, but also the most expensive of the newer 148 Phantom kits at $99.99. But we should hopefully restock this very soon. To the left, we have the Meng Phantom, in which case a McDonnell Douglas Phantom F4G Phantom II Wild Weasel. This is a fairly new tooling with high levels of detail and has an recommended retail price of $74.99. To the right, you will see one of Tiger Hobbies' own imports, the Zukimura F4, which we have the F4Js, F4Ss, F4Bs, F4Cs, later F4Es. In this case, we've got an F4C Phantom II Wild Weasel 4. And these have the lowest recommended retail price of the more modern 148 F4 kits at $69.99. And the detail on the Zukimura is very, very good. Well, it's incredible. It's at the very, very top end of plastic model kit detail. But can be a bit of a challenge for less experienced modelers. For those who wish to spend a little less, there are reasonable kits of the F4 by Atalieri for about £30. And there's also, living in the middle ground between the cheaper kits and the more expensive kits, is the Academy kit. It's not easy to get because distribution isn't brilliant in the UK on the Academy kits. And I think it's around about the 50 mark. But it lives in that centre ground between the cheap and the expensive ones. But it is a very, very good kit. And if you get a chance to buy one, it's worth taking a punt on that kit. If you also want a good price 148 Phantom model, we have the, just above, on top of the display, we have a couple Hobby 2000s, F4C and F4D, which are Vietnam Aces Vol 1 and Vol 2 for just $47.99. These are based on the excellent Hasegawa plastic, with US Air Force aces such as Robbie Knowles in Vol 1 and Steve Ritchie and Charles de Belvoir in Vol 2. When it comes to British F4 series kits, it started in 1968 with the 72nd scale Hasegawa F4K and the Frog F4K, and a little later in the early 70s with the Matchbox F4KM. These were okay, lacked obviously the detail of modern kits, but at least at the time the UK modeler had a British F4 version to build. In the late 1980s, 1987, Fujimi released the correctly titled Phantom FG.1 for the Royal Navy, followed by the RAF Phantom FGR2. But even some Fujimi versions still call them F4Ks and Ms. But these were very, very good kits and still hold their own today. In fact, you can see two Hobby 2000 models just placed on top of the Meng and the Zukimura Phantoms, both FG1s, late versions for the Royal Navy, and FG1s for the Royal Air Force, I think with the RWR radar warning receivers on top of the tails. These are great value, $23.99 for the Royal Navy one, because you've got a bit more in details, and $22.99 for the Royal Air Force one. These are great kits, continue to sell very, very well, and happily compete with the newer Airfix 172nd scale version, which I'll talk about a little later. In fact, for many years, the go-to kit in 72nd was the Fujimi, again for almost 30 years, until 2017, when Airfix at last released its own version of a British F4 Phantom in 172nd scale, initially FG1 to the Royal Navy, and later FG1/FGR2 to the Royal Air Force. Both these are absolutely superb kits, and currently on the Airfix website at an RRP of $34.99. We normally have them in stock, and in fact they should be back in stock quite soon, but they're superb kits. In 148, modelers again had to wait till late 1980s, in fact 1987 again, this time Hasegawa, to make 148 Phantom FG1s and again FGR2s. And again, these were the go-to 148 British Phantom kits for almost 30 years. And continued to be issued until quite recently. I think the last one I saw we got from the UK import was 2017. But for all the kits, and they are very good kits still, they are quite expensive, upwards of £60. But in 2019, Revell borrowed the tooling and released an FGR2 for just $29.99, and this proved very popular and was going for reasonable money. But I'm not sure how long that's going to go for with the announcement from Airfix. It was actually one of the great mysteries in modelling why no one for almost 30 years had updated the British Phantom subject. But on the 14th of January 2026, Airfix announced a great fanfare the new 148 Phantom FG.1, and I'm sure the Royal Air Force FGR2 will arrive at some point as basically the same aeroplane. There are some complaints about the price compared to the other new 148 toolings, but the Meng one's $74.99, the Zuki Miura one's $70 or $69.99, so the Airfix price at $74.99 for a brand new toolkit. I'm sure you'll get lots of great value and detail in the box. I think it's a fair price, so well done for Airfix for releasing the British version of the Phantom in 48. You know, it could have been done a little earlier, a bit like the Jaguar, but at least they're here, and I think the Airfix one will be with us mid-year 2026. Tiger Hobbies actually will do a great price on this model, but only when it arrives. We generally don't go for pre-orders, but when it arrives, it will be a great price. But, interestingly, this is a bit exclusive from Tiger Hobbies, I may have news of a larger scaled British F4 Phantom. Now, many of you know that about 5 years ago something was announced, but it never came into being. But I have got it on fair authority that it's about to go into production, certainly in 2026. And it may come through Tiger Hobbies imports, or it may not, but we shall find that out in the next few months. So this is really exciting. So 2026 is definitely going to be the year of the British Phantom variant in all the major scales. So I will finish this video off as a matter of interest. Earlier on I mentioned the cancellation of a number of aircraft that led to the British buying the F4 Phantom II. So this was basically the TSR-2 and the P1154. TSR-2, or Tactical Strike and Reconnaissance, was cancelled to massive overspend on the budget in every department, lack of communication between all the companies that would later make up the British Aircraft Corporation, and the Royal Air Force wanting the world and every capability under the sun, and the manufacturers promising the Royal Air Force, even though they knew that technically the capabilities were not available at the time. So in 1965, the new government had no choice but to cancel TSR-2, P1154 that was on really on the drawing boards, and an Armstrong Whitworth 681 strategic jet cargo aircraft. Now, if the government that lost that election in the previous year in 64 had still been in power, well, they may have had to cancel it as well, because TSR-2 had become one massive money pit. And what thought, I'll just finish with talking about that Armstrong Whitworth and the later Hawker Siddeley potential 681. As an ex-Royal Air Force supply guy, with an interest in obviously anything logistics and especially cargo aircraft, I think this was a case of chucking out the baby with the bathwater. And I think this would have possibly worked if they'd have left it as a basic short takeoff and landing jet cargo lifter. But the Royal Air Force suddenly turned around early in its design and said, oh, can it take off and land vertically like this new Kestrel or Harrier aircraft? And that basically killed it, because there was no way technology was going to make a massive aircraft, virtually not much smaller than a C-17, take off and land like a Harrier. And in fact, if you look at the most successful cargo lifter of recent times, the C-17 Globemaster III, the AWHS 681 kind of bears a fair resemblance. So obviously somebody thought it was a good idea. The failure of TSR-2, though, did lead to better procurement and better working relations between partners within industry, including European partners. And this led to, for the Royal Air Force, the Jaguar aircraft, the Tornado aircraft, and obviously the Eurofighter Typhoon. But here's a word of warning. and I'm not the only one. I thought about this 18 months when it was first announced. The Tempest. What we are seeing is that people are going to make this Tempest, again, promising the world to the Royal Air Force, with possibly a 4,000 mile an hour combat boost. Well, I'm no expert in aeronautics, but the only way you're going to get an aircraft to 4,000 mile an hour is to stick up a rocket up its jacksie, or they've invented the flux capacitor on the quiet. Let's hope that the Tempest does not turn into a modern TSR-2. Anyway, once again, thank you for taking time to watch this video. A little longer than our normal hobby videos, but it's always a pleasure to talk about one of my favourite aircraft, the McDonnell Douglas Phantom II. Thank you once again.